Hey Redeemer, welcome to the Daily Word for Tuesday, July the 14th. I want to read you our text. We're in Acts 24 today as part of the annual reading plan, and I want to walk you through it. And then there's really a big takeaway from this text, and I'm really excited to talk about it more. First, let me read it to you. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some of the elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against the apostle Paul. Tertullus is their lawyer, okay? They get an attorney. They're coming against Paul. If you remember, he's put on trial. They're trying to get him pretty much sacked, killed, done with for all his preaching, and they can't stand him. And they're divided, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, a little bit over resurrection and some different issues, but overall they're united in their hatred for Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix," he's appealing to Felix, and since your foresight, reforms are being made for this nation in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. He's basically puffing up Felix's ego. But to detain you no further, I beg your kindness to hear us briefly. We have found this man a plague. He's one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. So he goes on to accuse him. Of course, the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Who does that remind you of? Jesus of Nazareth. So he's accusing him of being a Christian and all of these things. Paul goes on then to defend himself and explains it quite clearly that he did no wrong, that his conscience is pure before the Lord. And he goes on to say, other than that, this one thing that I cried out while standing in verse 21 among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. So Paul, after explaining everything in his case, he says, I'm really here for one reason, because of an issue with respect to the resurrection. These guys can't figure out what they believe. They argue over it. I have simply said Jesus is the Christ. So he goes on to explain it. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, that's Jesus, put them off, saying, when Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I'll decide your case. So we see right there, perhaps, Felix taking some steps of prudence, being careful, knowing a little bit more about Jesus than these high priests and their lawyer would have thought. Maybe careful to come against one of the Lord's workers, maybe sensing some conviction, maybe a believer. We don't know until we keep reading and we find him give orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. In verse 23, so that's pretty neat. Felix seems like a pretty reasonable guy. He's going to let Paul have lots of visitors and have some liberty. And after some days, Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ. So now Felix wants to hear the gospel. His wife is Jewish. He's obviously sympathetic, perhaps, towards Jews. 25 reveals a real deep issue. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I'll summon you." So something happens in Felix's heart. Conviction, I don't know. But Paul doesn't hold back, does he? Look at what he says. Righteousness, self-control, the coming judgment. Paul gets a chance to preach, and does he talk about how Jesus is going to make his life easier, or how, hey, no big deal, or some motivational speech? No. Righteousness, self-control, the coming judgment. Now, it's a reminder, isn't it? Convicting one for me as a pastor, convicting for you as believers together. We're not here to appease the world. We're not here to please the world. We're not here to give in to the doctrines of the day or to do whatever people want us to do or to soften the message. We are here to preach the righteousness of Christ, self-control, obedience, following after the way, this Nazarene who's the Son of God, and coming judgment, that we will all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Felix gets convicted, and then verse 26, at the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul in prison. Listen to that, verse 26. He basically kept talking with Paul in hopes that he would bribe him. This was common back then. Perhaps he thought Paul had a little money. He had some good support from the churches. Maybe he was bivocational, tent making, doing pretty well. Maybe he had some deeper pockets, Felix perhaps thought. Looking for a bribe. Maybe because Paul was such a powerful leader in the church that people would bring money to Paul and say, hey, bribe your way out of this. Give Felix some pay. Whatever the reason, we see that Felix is convicted of his sin by Paul's preaching. We see that Paul is faithful to preach the hard truths, no matter what was on the line. And we also see Paul suffering faithfully, holding the line in prison, in the midst of a leader who's really just looking for a bribe. You know, it reminds me of one speed, one lane, one call, one message, one way. It didn't matter what Paul was going through. He kept walking to the beat of Christ. It didn't matter what the culture was saying. It didn't matter what the leader wanted, what the government wanted, what was happening around him, or how hard it was. He kept doing one thing. And it's the thing he said in 1 Corinthians 2:2 when he said, I'm determined to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. Live for Christ. March to the beat of his drum. One way, one culture, one timing, one person. Everything about Jesus. All of your life, all for him, all the way, all the time, every day. Love you, church. Hope that encourages you from Acts 24. We'll see you again tomorrow as we dig into Acts 25.